December 16th, 1944, dawn broke over the Ardennes and Hitler launched his last great gamble. In 5 days, the German advance split Allied lines, created the Bulge, and left towns like Bastogne isolated and freezing. By December 19th, the shock reached Eisenhower's headquarters. By December 20th, Bastogne was ringed in. The Allies called for help. One commander, George S. Patton, Jr., would be asked to perform what many called impossible: move a whole army on a winter road march, cut through fog and snow, and relieve a surrounded garrison in less than a week. This is the story of that pivot, its logistics, the stubborn men in Bastogne, and the moment Patton said, quietly and bluntly, "Play the ball."
On December 16, 1944, under dense fog and morning low clouds, German armor and infantry pierced the thinly held Allied front in the Ardennes. The attack's speed and secrecy stunned local commanders. Radios crackled with urgent reports as German columns punched through terrain the Allies had judged quiet. Communications were frail, supply lines immediately stressed, and weather grounded air support. By December 19, desperate messages reached Schaeff. The Germans threatened to split the Western Front and drive to the Meuse. On the ground, American soldiers traded stunned confusion for determined defense, improvising roadblocks, burning bridgeheads to slow armor, and calling in artillery where possible. The comment threads of later viewers who served or whose fathers served emphasize how the cold and fog made everything worse: frozen weapons, dead batteries, and men living in foxholes beneath a white sky.
Bastogne, a road junction in southern Belgium, suddenly became the key. On December 20, American forces were surrounded. Townsfolk and soldiers alike braced against artillery and patrols. The 101st Airborne and elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division found themselves cut off, short on ammunition, winter clothing, and medical supplies. German envoys demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became the hard American answer to coercion. The siege turned Bastogne into a freezing island irresolute, where men fought house to house and fought to keep roads unusable to enemy armor. Accounts from veterans and later commentators highlight the vital steadiness of airborne troopers and the symbolic weight of defiance, which bought time that would become the hinge for a wider Allied reaction. At Third Army headquarters, Patton received the order that would alter everything. Eisenhower asked Third Army to disengage from its current axis and move north to relieve Bastogne and blunt the German drive. It was a logistical and operational gamble, pivoting an entire army under winter conditions over narrow, icy roads while maintaining flank security. Patton's staff worked the maps. Routes were chosen to avoid choke points and preserve fuel. Night marches began amid sleet and a fog so thick drivers navigated by touch and memory. Patton's confidence in mechanized mobility and the reliability of American supply trains, the very capabilities many German commanders lacked by winter's end, became the backbone of the plan. Veteran recollections and modern commentators both note how Patton's willingness to endure the same hardships alongside his men tightened morale and set the tone for the forced march north.
As Third Army columns pushed north on December 23rd, the march became an exercise in mechanical endurance and navigation. Narrow Belgian lanes, choked with felled trees and abandoned vehicles, funneled convoys into single-file progress. Drivers worked from memory, guided by trail markers and rear lights. Crews dug stalled tractors free of snow and ice at roadside. Fuel discipline was obsessive. Every gallon mattered for the final push. Rear area units improvised field maintenance stations, cannibalizing ruined trucks to keep spearheads rolling. Along the way, small engagements and artillery harassment slowed movement. German patrols probed columns' flanks and tried to sever supply trains. Medics rode in ambulances stacked with frozen stretchers. Radio operators fought condensation and battery failure. The human cost of movement, men exhausted, engines overheated, nerves frayed, was as consequential as any firefight. Yet the rhythm of the march never stopped. Unit by unit, the Army threaded the Ardennes toward Bastogne. By Christmas Eve, patrols from Patton's columns began to make contact with enemy outposts. Small, sharp engagements tested the tempo. Infantry cleared farmsteads. Tank destroyers suppressed machine gun nests. Scouts reported minefields and blown bridges. Yet the weather, fog and low cloud, still blunted the full power of Allied air and artillery. Sporadic clearing in late afternoon gave brief windows for aerial reconnaissance that verified routes and located concentrations of German armor, but skies often closed again. Commanders used those precious daylight minutes to reroute traffic around choke points and to move high-priority supplies forward. Local civilians witnessed long columns and carriages of wounded. Ration parties distributed emergency food parcels. Veteran accounts and commenters later underlined a blunt truth. The cold was a silent enemy that affected accuracy, morale, and the survivability of both men and machines. The day closed with a fragile hope, roads improving, but the weather could still betray them.
Christmas Day found Third Army in hurried reorientation. Patton, consumed by maps and reports, issued terse orders. A 2-brigade-wide drive, maintained momentum, no detours for parades. Unit commanders pushed men forward despite the date. Supply officers prioritized ammunition, winter clothing, and fuel. The march's tempo increased as engineers cleared culverts and bridged wooden gaps with expedient Bailey-style repairs. Radio dispatches tracked estimated arrival times in hours, not days. The word urgency became a constant. Along the march, officers distributed chocolate and limited rations to men who recognized the day but felt little of its comforts. The psychological effect of leadership mattered. Patton's forward-looking presence, or at least the knowledge of a relentless commander at the map table, hardened resolve in the columns. By midnight, the advance had closed crucial mileage, setting the stage for the final approach toward Bastogne. On December 26, elements of Patton's spearhead, fighting units, and armored recognition fought the final miles into the ring around Bastogne. The approach wasn't a single clean breakthrough, but a series of local fights, clearing roadblocks, suppressing flanking fire, and dislodging German detachments from farm strongpoints. Tanks and half-tracks rolled into town amid smoke and rubble. Medical detachments pushed ambulances into makeshift clearing zones. The garrison's defenders, exhausted but still defiant, greeted arriving columns with guarded relief. Command liaison teams linked up, allowing coordinated resupply and evacuation planning. Air support, finally able to fly more consistently as weather improved, began to mark supply drop zones and to spot for artillery. Casualties were still being brought out. Hospitals and surgical stations overflowed, but the vital artery for supplies was reopened. Bastogne's ring had been pierced, not by miracle, but by logistics, tenacity, and the cumulative effect of months of training and discipline.
After entry, priority shifted from marching to consolidation. Engineers cleared mines and repaired key bridges. Quartermasters unloaded pallets of ammunition, winter clothing, and medical supplies. Field hospitals established triage chains. Surgical teams worked round the clock. Commanders reorganized patrol schedules to prevent German counterattacks aimed at severing the now open route. Importantly, the arrival of armored units and resupply eased pressure on Bastogne's defenders, allowing some counter-patrols to push German probes back. Public morale, both among troops and in messages from home, surged. A battered town hailed, a gap closed, and the German timetable stalled. Military analysts later cited the resupply and the steady availability of fuel and parts as decisive. Without those, the relief would have been fleeting. By December 27, the initiative had shifted. The German offensive had lost its most dangerous tempo, and the Allies began to plan the methodical rollback that would end the Bulge.
As weather steadily cleared between December 28 and 30, Allied air forces reasserted a lethal advantage. Fighters and fighter-bombers rejoined tactical missions, strafing German supply columns, and conducted interdiction sorties that choked the enemy's ability to replace fuel and ammunition. Transport aircraft and gliders began precise supply drops into Bastogne's marked zones. Parachute bundles of winter boots, ammunition crates, and medical stores landed within cleared fields monitored by signal panels and flares. Forward air controllers coordinated with artillery and Patton's advancing columns, using aerial observation to call fire on German concentrations. The psychological impact was immediate. German troops, long used to local air superiority in many theaters, now faced aircraft that could not be ignored. Logistics that had been fragile for days were bolstered, and the operational tide began to favor the Allies. Air power amplified ground mobility and turned supply into an offensive instrument.
Entering January, Allied commanders shifted from relief to attrition and methodical counterattack. Small coordinated assaults pushed German outposts back from key crossroads using combined armor infantry teams supported by concentrated artillery. Patton's tank units exploited repaired bridges and cleared routes to envelop isolated enemy battalions, while infantry consolidated cleared ground against immediate counterprobes. German units, already suffering from stretched lines and dwindling fuel, were forced into piecemeal defensive fights. Mechanized counterstrokes lacked the cohesion necessary to regain lost ground. Medical evacuation remained a pressing concern. Forward surgical teams worked in bitter cold to treat frostbite and shrapnel wounds. Many wounded were airlifted as weather allowed. The operational calculus now emphasized wearing down the German spearhead by denying resupply and seizing tactical depth rather than expensive frontal breakthroughs. The result? A steady rollback of the Bulge's western face.
By early January, the German offensive had expended its momentum. Lines of communication were splintered. Armored formations limped with sputtering engines and empty fuel tanks. Allied armored and infantry units, now reinforced and resupplied, pressed coordinated drives that converted local success into operational collapse. German commanders faced impossible choices: commit scarce reserves to failing flanks, or attempt ordered withdrawals through roads now dominated by Allied fire and air interdiction. Supply choke points in the rear, once permissive, were now contested and interdicted heavily. Prisoners and abandoned equipment multiplied in operational reports. The scale of retreat varied by sector, but the strategic picture was clear. Hitler's December gamble had failed. Command assessments later recorded that the Bulge's failure owed as much to Allied logistical resilience, exemplified by Third Army's mobility and air power, as to German tactical attrition.
With active offensive operations receding, attention turned to casualty accounting, burial details, and civilian relief. Field hospitals stabilized seriously wounded, while evacuation corridors sent wounded rearward to fully equipped hospitals. Graves registration units began the grim work of identification and temporary internment. Chaplains and unit historians recorded names and actions. Civilians, whose homes had been turned into temporary barracks or operating rooms, faced rebuilding, clearing snow, salvaging food, and reestablishing rudimentary services. Military civil affairs units organized distribution of emergency rations and medical teams to combat disease. The human ledger of the Bulge became painfully apparent. Units tallied killed, wounded, missing, and the bitter non-combat losses from exposure. Yet recovery also produced testimony and camaraderie, letters home, veteran memoirs, and interviews that later shaped public memory of Bastogne and the Bulge as a crucible of Allied resilience. In the weeks after the Bulge, Allied commanders executed a strategic reassessment.
The German ability to launch large-scale offensive operations on the Western Front had been decisively blunted. Manpower and material shortages now constrained German options. For the Allies, the victory validated combined arms doctrine, mechanized logistics, and the decisive integration of air power with ground maneuver. Politically and morally, the relief of Bastogne, Patton's forced march, and the steadfastness of units like the 101st Airborne became touchstones for Allied propaganda and public morale. Military historians later argued that while casualties were high, the failure of the Ardennes offensive hastened Germany's defensive posture in the West and freed Allied resources for the final push across the Rhine. The Bulge, in short, was a last gasp rather than a prologue. Its failure shifted the initiative irrevocably.
After stabilizing the Bulge's perimeter, Allied forces transitioned to systematic offensives to secure flanks and clear routes for a spring advance to the Rhine. Patton's Third Army pushed east and northeast to eliminate German salients that could threaten the lines of communication feeding the forward armies. Engineers and combat engineers worked feverishly to repair blown bridges and reopen rail spurs, while reconnaissance elements probed hedgerows and bocage for hidden anti-tank positions. The Germans, short on fuel and facing growing attrition, used local counterattacks and prepared strongpoints to slow the momentum. Intelligence units interrogated prisoners and exploited captured documents to update order of battle estimates. For soldiers on the ground, the transition meant relentless patrols, clearance operations of isolated farm compounds, and the slow grinding business of turning tactical gains into secure supply routes for larger operations aimed at the Ruhr and the German frontier.
In early February, the operational timetable faced a concrete, watery obstacle, the Ruhr River and its control dams. German forces deliberately released water from upper reservoirs to flood downstream valleys, turning fords into deep, fast channels and washing out bridges. The result was a forced pause in major offensive pushes. Engineers raced to build causeways and Bailey-type crossings, while Allied planners adjusted dates for coordinated attacks further east. The delay was not merely physical. It bought German commanders fleeting time to reassign units and scavenge fuel. Yet Allied air interdiction and continued patrolling eroded those gains. Behind the scenes, quartermasters stockpiled bridging materials and extra pontoons. Commanders recalculated logistics to ensure that when water subsided or crossings were built, advancing divisions could surge forward without pausing. Veterans later recalled the Ruhr episode as a reminder that terrain, engineered or natural, could still shape operational tempo, even in mechanized warfare.
Once the Ruhr crossings were secured or bypassed, Allied armies resumed aggressive drives into the German borderlands. The offensive tempo rose. Armored columns and infantry thrust through industrial towns, clearing pockets of resistance and overrunning supply depots. The Siegfried Line's outworks, the concrete bunkers and minefields that once defined Germany's western defensive belt, were attacked in detail, forced by coordinated artillery preparation and armor infantry teams. Patton's emphasis on speed and shock pressed local German units into withdrawal, scattering organized defense into ad hoc delaying actions. Civilian factories that had supported war production were captured, and liberated laborers and forced labor camps began to emerge in reports, adding a moral urgency to military objectives. Allied logistics, now seasoned by the Bulge experience, moved repair crews ahead of spearheads, ensuring roads, fuel dumps, and medical evacuation kept pace with the advance. By early March, the Rhine, the great natural barrier into Germany's industrial heartland, loomed as the next operational objective. Commanders orchestrated wide flanking maneuvers and river reconnaissance to identify feasible crossing sites while deceiving German defenders about main effort directions.
Patton's doctrine favored rapid, multiple-axis approaches to keep the enemy off balance and to exploit any collapse. Logistics funneled bridging equipment and assault boats to forward depots. Engineers rehearsed river crossings under simulated conditions. The human dimension intensified. Soldiers anticipated that once across the Rhine, German organized resistance would be tested in its final, desperate phases. Intelligence warned of potential local counterstrokes, but the cumulative effect of attrition, logistical superiority, and air interdiction made the strategic outcome increasingly probable. The Allies prepared to transform tactical crossings into a full operational breach into the German interior. Late March saw the first of the major Allied crossings into Germany proper. Engineer assault boats, pontoon bridges, and concentrated smoke screens enabled infantry and armor to establish footholds on the far bank. Once units secured bridging heads, logistical trains surged across. Fuel, ammunition, replacement crews, and field hospitals. Patton's mobile columns then exploited the seams, driving deep into German rear areas, seizing rail junctions, and disrupting command nodes. German rear guards offered stiff resistance in towns and along railway embankments, but the lack of coherent reserves and worsening supply shortages made sustained defense untenable. Prisoner numbers multiplied. Whole regiments capitulated as commanders weighed the hopelessness of continued resistance. For Allied soldiers, the progression from riverbank to open country was a tangible sign that the strategic endgame had begun. The collapse of Nazi Germany, once a looming possibility, had become an operational reality.
With Rhine crossings secured, Allied columns accelerated into the German interior in early April. Patton's forces executed fast, mechanized thrusts aimed at severing rail and road hubs that sustained the German front. Mobile task forces raced across country, bypassing isolated pockets of resistance to capture junctions, depots, and fuel dumps. The intent: paralyze German operational mobility by destroying the lines that allowed reserves and supplies to move. Infantry secured towns, while armor performed envelopment and exploitation. Intelligence teams fanned out to interrogate captives and capture documents, converting tactical gains into operational advantage. The pace imposed severe strain on maintenance crews, but the payoff was evident as resupply for German units slowed to a trickle, and communications devolved into local, disconnected commands. The deep advances hastened the fracturing of German defense in the West. In mid-April, the German chain of command increasingly unraveled. Regimental and divisional commanders reported empty billets, deserters, and sporadic surrenders. Civilians sometimes negotiated local ceasefires to allow food and medical relief. Partisan and resistance groups emerged openly to assist Allied patrols. Communications with Berlin were erratic, and directives often arrived too late or conflicted with immediate reality. Allied psychological operations amplified the effect, broadcasting surrender terms and highlighting the futility of continued resistance. Prison camps and temporary detention centers rapidly filled as thousands of soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and fuel-starved, laid down arms in the face of overwhelming Allied mobility. For Allied leaders, the operational focus shifted from aggressive encirclement to orderly processing of surrendered troops and rapid restoration of basic services to liberated areas.
As Allied columns pressed deeper, they began to uncover the darker consequences of Nazi rule: liberated forced labor camps, starving civilians, and atrocity sites. Medical teams, chaplains, and civil affairs units mobilized emergency relief, food convoys, mobile hospitals, and shelter, while security units documented evidence and preserved sites for investigation. Soldiers and civilians alike confronted harrowing scenes that intensified the moral imperative of the campaign. Reports filtered upward and into press dispatches. Public opinion and military directives demanded care for survivors and thorough documentation of crimes. The scale of suffering varied, but the operational response was swift. Prioritize humanitarian access, secure sites against looting, and coordinate with relief organizations to move survivors to care centers. These weeks marked a transition from purely military objectives to profound human recovery efforts.
The first week of May closed the military campaign in the West. Localized fighting ceased as German high command collapsed and surrender orders spread. On May 7th and 8th, 1945, victory in Europe was declared. For soldiers in the field, the announcement was a mixed surge of relief, exhaustion, and reflection. Units performed formal surrenders, processed prisoners, and began occupation preparations. Patton's Third Army and other formations shifted from combat operations to stabilizing tasks, curfew enforcement, maintaining order in liberated towns, and assisting displaced populations. Flags were raised and ephemeral celebrations occurred in ruined squares, but the mood remained tempered by the cost of victory and the urgent needs of millions uprooted by war. Military planners turned quickly to demobilization, occupation governance, and the complex politics of post-war stabilization. In the immediate post-war months, Allied armies became provisional governments. Military governors, civil affairs officers, and logistics units coordinated to restore food distribution, reopen railways, and reestablish civil services. Law enforcement and public order required balance and firmness with compassion, preventing looting while enabling markets to resume. Displaced persons camps swelled as refugees, forced laborers, and POWs awaited repatriation. The scale of administrative work was massive. Censuses, identification, ration cards, and the reconstitution of local police forces. Political questions loomed: how to transition to civilian rule, how to handle collaborators, and how to integrate devastated economies into reconstruction plans. For soldiers used to combat, the bureaucratic grind of occupation was unexpected but critical. The success of immediate relief shaped longer-term reconciliation in liberated communities.
As troops rotated home and newspapers carried dispatches, the Battle of the Bulge and the relief of Bastogne entered public memory and the emerging literature of World War II. Veterans wrote memoirs, chaplains recorded names, and local ceremonies commemorated the dead. Historians began testing operational claims against archives, evaluating Patton's rapid maneuver, the logistical feats of Third Army, and the heroism of defenders like the 101st Airborne. Public narratives emphasized resilience and moral clarity, often distilled into single moments, McAuliffe's nuts or Patton's forced march. Veteran comments and oral histories enriched the record with human texture. The documentary record, however, also matured. Professionals scrutinized sources, corrected myths, and traced the Bulge's true costs and lessons for future doctrine in mechanized warfare. Memory and history thus entwined in shaping how the campaign would be taught and remembered.
The Bulge remains a study in the interplay of leadership, logistics, and morale. Patton's order, summed later as play the ball in military parlance, epitomized a doctrine: exploit mobility, preserve momentum, and force decisions on an opponent by seizing operational initiative. The relief of Bastogne was not a cinematic, singular rescue, but a composite of endurance, engineering, air-ground integration, and the grit of thousands of soldiers who endured cold and fire. Its lessons resonate in doctrine textbooks. Logistics can win battles, leadership matters at every level, and flexibility in command can turn crisis into opportunity. As historians continue to parse documents and veterans' voices fade, the Bulge stands as a reminder that strategy and human will together shape outcomes, and that in war, the smallest decisions on a winter road can change history.
Thank you for watching.
Subscribe to our channel for more.